mix of presentation materials for you, and I've got some opportunities to just open up the floor. And those of you that are here in the room that would want to comment or share any ideas or just ask questions, because we're going to be talking about some things that make a lot of sense to folks, but maybe the terminology is a little bit foreign. So if there's opportunities, or if you have any questions in your minds, there will be opportunities to be able to raise those. If you happen to be watching this on the live stream, and I believe that's going out via Facebook.
Correct.
Okay, so feel free to comment stuff right in the comment feed there. I don't have the ability to see that right now, but I can take into account some of those comments whenever we get through the meeting and are debriefing. And if there's a specific question that you might have for the process, if you're so inclined to not only comment, but I'll share my contact information at the end of the meeting if you'd like to reach out to me directly and get a specific answer to any questions that you might have. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started here. So I'm going to run through some slides. People that know me personally know that I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint, but absent PowerPoint, I have a tendency to ramble. So with the bullet points up there, it'll kind of keep me to task. So I promise you that you will appreciate the PowerPoint slides that we have for this particular meeting. And you can see quick agenda. Not a lot on the agenda. I keep it brief. That way we can have plenty of time to talk about the items that actually appear there. So I'll give you a quick overview as to who I am, and then we'll go into a little bit of what is a hazard mitigation plan. That's what we're here to talk about tonight, to get some feedback on. So I'd like to be able to tell you a little bit of Mitigation 101, the genesis of the planning process, why the plan is done at the local government level, and what that means to everybody that's just a citizen out in the county. With that, two things follow on very naturally from that hazard mitigation plan because they address the two primary components of said plan. So we'll talk about hazards and risks, and I'll put a slide up that actually lists the hazards that we've included in the planning process thus far, and we'll have an opportunity for you to question some of those, suggest that we add maybe some instances that we want to make sure that we include under those headings. And then we'll talk about project types and how that relates to risk reduction, and then we'll just have some open floor for Q&A. So, without further ado, I told you I'd tell you a little bit about who I am, because you probably haven't seen me before, and some people say I talk funny. So let me give you an idea as to who it is I am. Well, my name is Jeff Harvey. I'm the owner and preparedness division manager of JH Consulting, LLC. And we are an emergency management and safety firm out of Buchanan, West Virginia, that's working with Washington County Office of Emergency Management to do the required 5-year update to Washington County's hazard mitigation plan. So I've been doing this kind of work since about 2003, and actually hazard mitigation is how I got into the emergency management world. I founded JHC in 2006 and have been doing exclusively emergency management work ever since then. So in addition to that role, I teach executive leadership with an emergency management bent at university. So this is kind of where I've been with this. This is the second time we've worked with Washington County folks on this particular project. And the company footprint, we provide services not only in Maryland, but in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio primarily. So I appreciate the opportunity to not only work on the plan, but to be here to be able to present the process to you and then hear back for some folks that are ground level here in the county. Now, I told you that we would talk about hazard mitigation 101. So what is hazard mitigation? Well, it's a fancy term that essentially means risk reduction. So what we're really going at here is trying to identify what hazards we have in our communities and then try to identify ways that we can lessen the losses that we might incur as a result of those hazards. That's the very practical reason for doing a hazard mitigation plan. Now, the plan is actually, there's a regulatory driver behind it. So the lingo behind all of that is it's governed by Section 322 of the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, as enacted by Section 104, I think it is, of the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. So if you caught all of that and you want to Google it, I'm sure there's all kinds of wording that'll keep you awake at night for a long time. But the long and the short of it is the Stafford Act is what allows communities to get assistance from the federal government whenever bad things happen. It's also the mechanism by which we try to proactively examine some of those things and identify ways that we might be able to reduce some of our losses before they happen. Now, within that regulatory driver, the requirement for a hazard mitigation plan at the government level is an eligibility criterion for federal mitigation funding. So what does that mean? Well, there are three primary programs. There's a few other sources, but three really primary programs that go into this. And they are the Building Resilience Infrastructure and Communities, BRIC program, which is kind of on the front foot. And that's a competitive program where you can apply for projects, for funding for projects that can reduce risk ahead of time. Another common program tied to the mitigation plan is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP. Now, HMGP is a designated allotment of funding that comes after we've had a declaration. So if we've had a disaster situation, it gets a federal declaration. Any money that comes in for public assistance, individual assistance, there's a percentage of that that's held aside for HMGP or mitigation purposes. And then the other program that's really getting a lot of play now that's tied to this is the HHPD program, and that is High Hazard Potential Dams program. And this is, you've probably heard some things in various media outlets about the state of infrastructure in America, and we're looking at water systems, highway systems, power grid, natural gas systems, dams, lots of different critical infrastructure around the country, and making sure that we are upgrading that at a rate that tries to come close to the age that we have on some of those systems. Well, the HHPD program targets dams, and the reason that I say that those three programs are tied to the mitigation plan is if a community would like to apply for funding under those programs, they have to have an approved, adopted hazard mitigation plan in place as an eligibility criterion for those. So that's why communities go through this process. They go through it every 5 years, and that 5-year process is just a way for us to be able to say, okay, these hazards remain relevant. Here's some projects or initiatives that we've done over the course of the past 5 years, and we can kind of measure our progress along the way. So that's the regulatory driver. So essentially that's administered out of FEMA. So when I say that we have an approved hazard mitigation plan in place, the entity at the federal level that will approve that for Washington County is FEMA Region 3. Now, there's a state component of that as well, and that's the Maryland Department of Emergency Management, or MDEM. They have a mitigation branch or a mitigation division that works a lot of these projects at the state level. So, kind of under that broad heading of works the projects, they manage a lot of the programs that feed into this. So when you think about things like repetitive loss, severe repetitive loss properties, when you think about the NFIP, or the National Flood Insurance Program, those are all kind of corollary elements of this. And the MDEM mitigation folks have access to a lot of information under those, and they use that for comparative purposes with not only the mitigation plan, but some other more specific, mitigation type documents. What they do is they're the state entity that approves the plan. So when we finish this process that we're currently working on, we will first submit it to MDEM. They will go through it, approve it. If it meets their approval, they'll send it on to FEMA Region 3. If it meets FEMA Region 3's approval, they'll issue what's called an approved pending adoption letter, at which time the county, cities, and towns here locally will go through an adoption process for that. So that takes care of the approved, adopted hazard mitigation plan. It's the eligibility criteria. So that's sort of the planning process. So for those of you that are general public, Washington County residents, what does it mean for you? Well, the planning process is largely a local government activity. State government goes through a state level plan. FEMA has a role to play in some planning as well. But it filters down to the local level here. The general public, in its most simple form, is a stakeholder in that process. So what we've done is we've formed a steering committee of folks that's typically various county departments, some other kind of technical expert entities, as well as your city and your towns here in the community. And they've been kind of providing 25,000 foot level guidance to me as a contractor as to what research I need to do, what types of projects we might want to consider, help survey those communities to see what capabilities are in place to support hazard mitigation, and just make sure that administratively we meet all the elements that's going to get the plan approved. But we need to involve, that's a group of stakeholders, we need to involve all of our stakeholders, which involves the public. So this project is underway. And what we need to do is make sure that the public has an opportunity to contribute input to the plan before it's developed. And then whenever we get it drafted, you'll have an opportunity to take a look at that. Largely, through online means, you'll be able to see a draft copy of the plan as everything is written out. But we want to make sure that we do those two things, input and then review after the fact. So tonight, when we talk about hazards and projects, when we get just straight up ideas from you, that's very good. I can take that down. We can plug that back out through our participating jurisdictions, as well as our steering committee, try to incorporate some of your input that way. But also, if there's just questions that folks ask, well, that's good for us too, because when we talk about launching this plan and what we do over the next 5 years, maybe there's an education element to that. Maybe there's just some things, a question leads us to understand, we need to do some homework. We've got to do a little bit of research here and try to figure some things out and learn a little bit. So those questions are just as valuable as the direct input that you would like to see in that plan. Now, I mentioned you're a stakeholder. So why do we care if risk is reduced at a county level? Well, if we can get to where we have known risk areas, think of things like designated floodplains, even think of a hazard like land subsidence, where we can look at soil types and geologic formations and kind of have an idea as to where we might have some subsidence type problems. Well, we can look at those areas, and if we see that we have a lot of structures, whether those are private property, whether those are public structures, that are in those areas, well, then we can do some outreach to those folks, and we can say, hey, here's a hazard you might not know about. And sometimes that knowledge is power. Just knowing what you're at risk to can be kind of a big deal. You might be able to then implement some projects on your own because there's some things that you can do from a personal preparedness standpoint. There's some things that you can do from a resilience standpoint where you might undertake some projects there at your house. Other times we can look at some of those areas and we can think about how our communities are developing, growing, and changing, and we can make decisions about what that means. So, do we want to let high-value assets be constructed in an area that we know has problems with subsidence, or an area that we know is repetitively flooding? Again, that's not to bar any of that. Sometimes our land is finite. It is what it is, and that's the developable area. But again, that knowledge is power, and we can make some good decisions with that. So you all as property owners, if you're one of the ones that didn't know that you were subject to that particular risk and now you do, you're better positioned to be able to protect your assets that way. In other areas, if we can look at reducing risk in certain communities, then things like property values can have a chance to go up over time. We might even see some things like insurance premium decreases because we're having less claims be put into some of these processes. So there is actually an economic benefit over the long term as we strategically implement mitigation projects for the individual citizen. And then the last thing I would like to say is somebody who's done this for a long time and been in a lot of different communities, there's almost a tunnel vision aspect of working with certain entities that are often involved in emergency management and planning. We have a good idea of what the risks are. We know 90% of what we know, and we address that, and we do that very good. But sometimes we get a little complacent in that. We get routine with some of those things. And it takes a citizen to be able to say, hey, have you ever thought of this? That kind of jolts our memory a little bit, kind of resets us and makes sure that we're covering all bases. So and in your role as a stakeholder there, it's helpful for us to be able to make sure we're including some of that stuff. So that's mitigation in a nutshell. Those of you that are in the room, do I have any questions about what mitigation is, or maybe what's the process we're here for tonight? Anything? So, all right. So hazards and risks. So the requirements for a hazard mitigation plan necessitate that we include natural hazards. Now, what our steering committee here has done is wanted to look at not only natural hazards, but also technological hazards and human-caused hazards. So you'll see a mix of them up there. It's not a 50-50 mix, but I wanted to kind of split that up so you can see what is there. I want to explain these real quickly, and then what we can do is stop there for the first time and just kind of open up and see if there's any questions about those hazards or if there's anything that you want to add to that discussion. So I'm going to go down the list of natural hazards first. So the first one there is drought. And a lot of times what we think of is you hear drought and you think one of two things, agriculture or water supply. Well, in a sense, we've kind of got a little bit of a mix of both of those. But we're primarily looking kind of at water supply issues there, just a general dryness kind of thing. Drought is a climatic thing. It's a long-term type thing. We recognize instances where we have a hot, dry year, something like that. But there's some research done to kind of talk about when do we actually ascend into true drought conditions. So drought's one that a lot of people are quite familiar with. The next one on the list is extreme temperatures. Now, extreme temperatures is one of those things that we're just getting a little bit more about that. You know, rewind the clock 15 years ago, right? And we didn't always think of extreme temperatures as being a hazard. There were some notable instances. There was, you know, a lot of deaths attributed to an extreme heat event in Chicago, and I want to say that was mid-1900s. I can't remember exactly there. We had, you know, a few sporadic instances that would pop up that were extreme temperature related, but it didn't seem like it was all that frequent of a phenomenon. Well, now, just in the past few years, just in the past few months, we can remember when there's been cold snaps. We can remember when there's been, you know, really hot periods that have extended for a period of time. What was it, 2010, 11, 12, somewhere around in there, we had polar vortex events that came through and kept temperatures around the 0 mark. So we're starting to look at some of those challenges related to the extreme highs and the extreme lows. Fire appears in both columns. So, and that's because it accounts for a couple of things. On the natural side, it looks at wildland fires. Now, we don't have wildland fires around here like you might hear of being out in Colorado and California and places like that. But we do have fires that can occur in largely vegetative areas that are going to, you know, potentially get out of control with a lot of, you know, that would cover a lot of land and things like that. We've got some topographical challenges here in the area. You know, there's some mountainous terrain around, and that creates some challenges and some complexity variables associated with wildland fire. The other side of that, I'll just briefly dip into the technological human cost. Actually, it should have been over there. I forgot to put it over there. So the fire on that side of the house is looking like urban fire, looking like an industrial fire, things like that. So you caught me in my first typo tonight. On down to this flooding. So flash flood and riverine flooding, those are really two different hazards. So that flooding profile, the discussion that the space in the plan that we use to discuss flooding is actually pretty lengthy because we look at, you know, riverine flooding, which we can typically predict, both on a time variable and a location variable, is different than flash flooding, which we see happen a lot now in response to some heavy precipitation events. And it'll come up in certain areas, maybe areas we're not expecting it to come up, and then it'll go down just as fast as it came up. But just because it's quick doesn't mean it doesn't cause a lot of damage. So we try to address both of those hazards in that section. Land subsidence we mentioned. Land subsidence primarily looks at subsidence as opposed to slips, but that's something that can be open for discussion. Reportable disease epidemic, believe it or not, that was in previous versions of the plan. So it's not something that your committee added because we just are still kind of working our way out from a global pandemic. But that's the type of thing we're discussing here. You know, we want to look at things like COVID-19, we want to look at things like H1N1, we want to look back in history at some other things and try to anticipate some of the impacts there. And then the final two under natural are just our weather hazards, severe summer, severe winter weather. Now, we could have taken the track where we could have looked at severe summer weather and broken that out into thunderstorms, windstorms, tornadoes, hailstorms, lightning strikes. We could have done all those individual incidents. But our committee decided, you know what, those all kind of occur in tandem. They all kind of occur as part of some of these fronts and things that go through, so we want to consider those as a single entity. Same with winter. Rather than do snow, ice, and all those different things separately, you know, severe winter weather being the hazard. And on the tech human cost side, again, in addition to the fire, dam failure, and again, we're mentioning back that infrastructure type thing. We've got hazardous materials, which is kind of a manufacturing and industrial incidents, transportation-based incidents on highways, railways, all those different types of things that might be hazmat related. You've got a lot of major transportation routes through the area. So committee 5 years ago elected to put major transportation accident down as a hazard, and they've kept that this time around. And what we're looking at there is you might think, well, that's maybe a problem for the people that are involved in it, maybe a problem for the folks that get hung up and are late to work or a little later than getting home than they wanted to be. Why is that in a community-wide mitigation plan? Well, with some of the transportation routes we have here, major disruptions on the roadways, for example, equal major disruptions to just general commerce. So there can be some follow-on effects to some of that, and that's detailed in that profile. And then the last hazard up there is the opioid epidemic, and that was added again 5 years ago, and it was just a recognition that you know, we do have some societal issues that we want to get on top of and try to stay on top of. And not only is that a hazard in and of itself, because there's some definite impacts that are attributed to that, but that can exacerbate problems for folks whenever some of these other hazards occur. So if we get into one of these severe weather events where we end up with, just a lot of different types of impacts, folks that are in recovery, folks that are having issues with some of the addiction there might be disproportionately impacted by some of those impacts that come out of those storms. That's what we included in there. Let me pause there. There's a few of you in the room here. I'm just curious to know if there's any questions you have about any of those, anything you want to make sure we're covered in that, or is there any hazard that you want to make sure that we put on the list that we haven't?
Well, for example, there's cardboard and paper stored everywhere in Washington County. I mean, if the fire starts where I'm at, we can forget it. They don't ever get it out.
So you're talking just, there's a lot of fuel in populated areas and things like, we don't just have to look at.
It's commercial. It's commercial.
Okay, okay.
And then you got all that runoff going into the storm drain.
Yeah. So that's one thing that we've tried to look at here, and that's a great point. The idea of the runoff, and it's a two-headed monster, so to speak. We want to see, we need the development to come in, but we also want to recognize that whenever we put, a couple acres down as a parking lot, that we want to look at some things like that. So we're not saying that it's bad to put that parking lot in, but we might consider some things like on-site retention and addressing some of that runoff on-site before it goes into the creeks or it goes and overloads the systems and things like that.
Just like the Tesla cars, where them batteries, they're a hazard.
It's a different battle trying to put out a fire on one of those than it is. There was an interesting piece of literature that came around whenever the Chevy Volt was being marketed that would talk about specifically how to fight fires if you had a Volt involved in that, knowing where the battery was, how to kill the battery, and all that kind of stuff. Different.
And then you got the main one is that paper and cardboard, because it's the ground that is stacked so high you never get it out. There's no way they can get it caught on fire.
Okay.
Nothing's done about it. I understand these new businesses are coming in town and they're not doing anything for environmental.
Okay.
It's a live business coming in and they're not doing anything to the environment.
Okay.
Like the railroad cars are coming in, the build railroad cars here. It's hazard there.
Okay. Very good. I appreciate that.
How about intentional cyber disruption?
Potential cyber disruption?
Intentional
cyber disruption. Okay. Well, I guess potential and intentional would work there. Yeah. So we had some discussion about a few things that, and cyber was one of those. So when we look at like a cyber, when we look at just a general civil disturbance, when we look at something that might rise to the level of, say, terrorism, did we want to include that as a separate hazard? So our committee looked at like terrorism as a hazard and decided to keep that omitted because there's some planning efforts that are going on that are kind of different streams than the hazard mitigation plan. But we haven't left the discussion completely out because, sabotage and things like that, we see people intentionally shooting at transformer stations and things like that. I think that, and I'm going to work my way around to cyber, but some of those things I think are kind of those cascading types of effects that could make things eminently more difficult. That can add and compound some of these things. So, rather than call them out as a hazard themselves, we sort of made the strategic decision to look at them as cascading events or problematic types of events, and we did the same thing with cyber. So, but I think, and cyber is another one of those things where, from the standpoint of hazard mitigation, it's really more of like a target hardening prevention type of discussion there, and frankly, we're still learning a lot about it. So, in terms of what we can do for a community-wide type strategy, maybe the verdict's out on that. So, we want to make sure that we recognize some of those potential impacts. Certainly wouldn't want to dissuade anybody that's doing it personally or any business or entity out there that's trying to prepare for some of that. But right now, in terms of what we can do at a community level, it's a little murkier. Okay, thank you. Anything else hazard-wise? All right. And again, if you're watching the live stream and you want to type in anything in the comment feed, we'll check on that after the fact. I want to draw attention to, because I haven't mentioned it yet and I need to make sure. So I'm not sure how clear the slides are coming through, but down at the bottom of each of these slides, I've got a public survey link. And in addition to what we're doing tonight, we're going to have a public survey that's going to run for the next few weeks. And it's going to ask a lot of these hazard-based type questions. And what we've got is, so check out your local town's webpage, check out your local town's social media feeds. We're going to be sharing some of that there. We'll make sure that we get the word out in a couple of other ways to where you can access this public survey. And it's just an online Google Forms type survey. I want to say there's 25, 30-ish questions on that. Usually, whenever I look at the statistics for our communities that do it, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to go through the survey. So if you're interested in contributing something there, would love to have you log in and do that. Those of you that are in the room, if you'd like a paper copy of that survey before you leave, I can hook you up with that. And you can either log on and do it, submit it that way, or you can just hang out here and fill it in, and I'll enter it in manually before. But those of you that are watching at home, if you want to get involved with that, check that out. Again, that's a Google Forms survey, so I apologize that the link just looks like a bunch of gobbledygook there. But I promise you it's a legitimate link. And you will be seeing that come from some of your local government entities here over the next few days. You can get to it very easily that way. All right. So, back to the agenda. So, the other part of this is project types, right? So I told you when we were talking about hazard mitigation plans, we want to look at what the risks are, and then we want to look at what we can do to try to reduce those risks. So that's more of an action plan side of thing, a list of projects that we can undertake to try to reduce some of those risks. When I say when I talk about those projects, the projects that will appear in the plan, for that, the we is essentially your local government entities. So your towns, your counties, some of your kind of quasi-governmental agencies that are here in the community that might be working towards some of this. But for you, the citizen, that doesn't mean that there isn't things that you can do at your own home to be able to help protect some of your own assets. And one of the projects, actually, it kind of appears in a couple of different ways on our current kind of working list, is just to make sure that we fold in some of those public education outreach efforts that tells people what they can do. So it's not only that you'll get the chance to learn about what risks we have out there and where those risks are, but we'll also be sharing information with you about what you can do. And some of those things are simple things. It has to do with just, what your options are for, say, backup power at your place or something along those lines. But other things, some people might not realize that, we can do our landscaping in a certain way that can help us out with fire there. We can keep some of our larger trees and stuff trimmed up or off a certain distance off our house to maybe lessen the possibility that a limb is going to go through the ceiling or something along those lines. So we'll be sharing some personal preparedness, personal mitigation type information as we get into launching this plan. But project types at the local government level, this is sort of a kind of an overview type of thing. In the blue box on the left-hand side of the screen, you see what is the revised mitigation goals that our community steering committee has come up with for this particular update. And there's 4 of them, and they're necessarily broad. So the way these goals are written is just we want to guide our action kind of in the same direction, right? We don't want to just be trying to go all over the place. But let's get focused on a small number of pathways and try to make some progress along those pathways. And we may never actually achieve all these goals, but they sort of organize our effort. So the first one is just maintain and enhance the jurisdictional capability to make the county less vulnerable to hazards. So the nature of the game changes quite a bit on some of these things. We learn more about these hazards. The weather-related hazards change somewhat over time. So just make sure everybody's got the latest information, right? And they're getting the right training, they've got the right people in place, they've got the right data in place to be able to make some of those decisions. The second one, they're educating local officials and the public about the benefits of and the opportunities to conduct mitigation at community and personal levels. This speaks to what I was talking about with that outreach. Just making sure that we look at the options, what we have available. I can tell you over time, what a lot of people associate with mitigation is one of 3 things. It's usually like a FEMA buyout. We've all heard that. It could be like a safe room or something like that, particularly if we're out in the Midwest where it's, they're really prone to tornadic activity out there. Or you may hear recently, we've talked a lot about like auxiliary power, generators for critical facilities and things. But there's a lot more that actually could be risk reduction. So we want to make sure that the public and local officials know what their options there are. We don't have to go through those 3 boxes all the time. We want to protect existing and future properties and infrastructure from the hazards that could affect the county. So that's sort of a broad thing there. You know, we want to recognize that the built environment is important to what we're doing here. In fact, most of the time whenever we get to something that is a disaster, it's not the hazard that occurred, it's the impacts to that built environment that makes it a disaster. So there's a lot of interesting discourse out there about, do we truly have any natural disasters? Because it's natural hazards that impact our built environment. Well, we recognize that. We want to make sure that we can protect that built environment as much as we can. So you can see how there's a lot of projects that would fall under that goal. And then the last one there, promote sustainable development to improve the quality of life in the community. So what we're trying to get at there is a couple of different things. Sustainability in the traditional sense. I know that word's made its rounds in various media outlets and other reporting and stuff over the past couple of decades. But we also recognize that hazard mitigation should not be something that's an extra thing you have to do. It shouldn't be a limiting factor in a lot of different ways. We want to make sure that we're being responsible with respect to our risk reduction alongside our growth and development as communities. So, when we talk about that promote sustainability, let's make sure that as we develop, we're thinking about things like resilient construction and some of those other practices that can help us kind of buffer ourselves, be able to bounce back from some of the hazards and risks that we know we have. So those are the goals that our steering committee's been working with. We'll pause in a minute and get some comment on that. But first I want to tell you about the types of projects that we can have. Those of you that are in the room, I gave you a handout that actually appears in the FEMA Local Hazard Mitigation Planning Handbook. If you'd like to Google that, there's some insomnia medicine for you. But it's good information. It can talk about what goes into a hazard mitigation plan. But it talks about 4 different types of mitigation projects that we can undertake. Now I'm going to explain those in a minute. First one is local plans and regulations. And these are the things that local government authorities can do, policies, codes, and stuff like that, to try to make sure that we're developing the land in a way that's not going to unnecessarily expose us to a lot of hazards. Certain communities find this to be a very effective, or projects that are under that type to be very effective. Other communities are a little more hesitant to go in that particular direction. But some examples could be comprehensive plans, a hazard mitigation plan, just organizing our efforts on some of that. And then you see the normal regulations. You see land use ordinances, zoning, building codes, all those types of things that fall under this particular heading. The second one there is structure and infrastructure projects. So all these things to do with the built environment, like we just talked about. All types of those projects would be the ones that would fall under that. So you can see where we're talking about modifying existing structures, moving existing structures, perhaps building structures to help harden us against some of the risks that we know we have. Acquisitions and elevations, utility undergrounding, things like structural retrofits, flood walls, retaining walls, all those types of things go under that particular type of hazard. So the right side of the screen changes. These are the other 2. We have natural systems protection. We talk about that sustainability stuff that we mentioned there. We look at sediment and erosion control. We look at stream channel issues where we restore the stream corridor. We look at things like forest management. We look at where green space and all of that is. Can we get to where, the heavy rainfall, for example, is dealt with in a very natural way before it gets to some of our built-up areas and causes some problems. And then finally, education and awareness programs. We know what those are. We've already mentioned a few of those tonight. But those direct, intentional efforts to try to help everybody understand what their risks are, what they might be able to do for that, how they can participate in some solutions for that. So those are the different types of projects that we can take a look at. Let me just pause there. Those of you that are in the room, see if there's questions or comments about the types of projects we might want to look at. All right. So we're moving right along here. We're kind of down to the end of the agenda. And there were a couple of things that I wanted to make sure that we had, a direct Q&A on, hazards and project types. But I also recognize that this is one of those instances where folks might just have questions about what the heck it is we're doing. So I always like to end these types of meetings with just a session to say, okay, the floor is open. Anybody that's here, do you have any questions about what we're doing, why we've included certain things, or just general types of things related to hazard mitigation? All right. Okay, so with that being said, that's all I have by way of presentation. I know I'm running a little bit ahead of schedule here. So what I can do is I can go back. Do we have the ability to be able to see comments and things? Okay. So, I can try to address some of those. I've also got, if those of you that are in the room would like to have a copy of that survey to take a look at, I can give you that. And we can just kind of hang out, and if anything pops into your mind, we can try to address it. All right.
Well, you didn't hear anything about it.
Whatever you want to do. If you want to do it now and leave it right there at the table, I'll take it with me when I leave. If you want to take it home and think about it some, you can certainly do that too. All right. How do you think? You want to read them out to me? You want me to come back and see it? Or
We just need this public survey link uploaded.
yeah. To upload it? Okay. Sure. So I can probably, what I'll do is I'll just have to send that to you.
Just email it to me and we'll share.
I can do that as soon as we finish up the meeting here. So. Any questions pop up or anything?
That was the only question.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, we will get that out. We'll get that emailed in. As a matter of fact, we'll do that before we leave this meeting, so it'll be up, in relatively short order. And so anybody that's watching, appreciate it. Those of you that came tonight, appreciate it. And barring anything else, we'll go ahead and adjourn our public meeting. Oh, I said I would give you my contact information if you had questions or anything like that.
Where would we go to see the report from 5 years ago?
Is that on the OEM's webpage or the county government's
The
webpage?
county website, the actual plan is on the county website.
No.
There's a link on the county website.
Okay.
I think it's under our tab.
Okay. We can drop that in the comments.
Okay. Okay, so my contact information, if anybody has any questions about this, and I'll make sure that this also appears along with the link, you can email me direct. I'll do this, but I have one of the longest email addresses known to man. So I'll spell it out, and you're more than welcome to send some things to me. And again, it'll appear in the comment feed. But my name is Jeff Harvey, and my email address is all lowercase, all one word, J Harvey. That's JHARVEY. That's a V as in violin, not a D as in dog. So V as in violin, EY. At jhcpreparedness.com. So jhcpreparedness.com. And again, I'll make sure that gets in the comment feed. If you're like me, you'll be thinking of things, and all of a sudden at 3 a.m., you'll think, man, I wish I would have asked that. So this will give you an opportunity to just drop it in a line. I'll share it with our steering committee so everybody's got situational awareness, and we'll get you an answer back to any specific questions that you might have. Okay. Last call Q&A for the room. All right. So thanks very much again to those that came. Thanks for those that watched. Appreciate it. Good to have some folks involved in the process, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.